Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 423, January the 11th, 1980. I mentioned several weeks ago that the price of tapes the first of the year would go up to $4.30 instead of $4. And for people that live in California, that's 26 cents in addition, $4.56 for each tape. The tape center has increased costs as its postage expenses and the increased rate of the tapes, and they haven't raised their prices for several years. So many of you order tapes in advance, prorate it or figure out that extra 30 cents per tape and then send it to the tape center or send it to me as you do your regular checks, and I'll pass it on to them in case you didn't make allowance for that 30 cents per tape. The return address on the cassettes going out now will no longer have the name of the Famous Voices Museum at Fisherman's Wharf here in Monterey. It will have my return address, and you have to send, if you have problems with the tapes, send them back to me and I'll deliver them over there. They duplicate the tapes for me, but they no longer wish to have their name associated with the contents of the material that's included. That's their privilege. They don't have to. They have mentioned that I'm beginning to sound too un-American and that the content of the material is getting too militant, and they no longer want to be associated with the content. That's perfectly okay with me, and I understand that position. As for my own political view, for some of you that just beginning to take the tapes or have known me for a long time, I consider myself a severe critic of the United States of America. I see the faults of other countries too, but I live in this country, and I have to be busy cleaning this up just as I would be a critic of my own home or my own surroundings, and it would be necessary to keep those in order. It doesn't matter how other people keep house or what they do. My own immediate country, family, person has to remain somewhat organized and clean and moral and very particular about the way this life is lived in order to make it the best possible, not only for me, for the people around me or my community. I'm tired of assassination teams that are sent all over the world from the United States. I don't like phony elections where we don't have a choice of a candidate and the candidates are killed off. I don't like poison in our food and air or corruption, exploitation of the native population here. The Indians, 1/3 of them are now sterilized, and many are getting uranium treatments and cancer from the Indian reservations, leaking uranium and other problems that they're suffering with, and children removed to be educated in Mormon families. I'm against mind control and radio waves and leaking microwaves and ignorance and greed and stupidity around us, and organized crime and drugs and narcotics, particularly as it pertains to the White House and the Justice Department and the high public officials. There's a lot of things I don't like, and I'll speak about them until I'm no longer here, until I die, and nobody has to be associated with this name. I'm proud of it, and I'll put on any envelope. It's me, Mae Brussell, and I hope it becomes a household word someday around this country. I've met a lot of interesting people through the research, and I have contacted or been in contact with many people, researchers of my own peer group. This week, Ladislaus Farrago called me from back east. I believe he was in Boston, and he's coming to the West Coast and wanted to meet me. I have a list of his books, Aftermath, and several of the others on the various sheets that I've handed out. He was the gentleman from the OSS and CIA who first produced the story of the passports issued by Montini in the Vatican for Martin Bormann and Nazi spies. That was an Aftermath. Farrago has Game of the Foxes and another book, Destroy After Reading. I believe that's the name. I don't have that other book of his, but I have Game of the Foxes and Aftermath. And I told him I'd meet him at the Stanford Hoover Library. That is the repository of Hitler's papers and the Tsar's papers, and it's become a great library for studying revolution and counter-revolution. And I've never gone up to use that library for research, mostly because there's so much to do right here that it just doesn't make sense to go that far to travel. but he said he would give me a tour of the library and many parts of it, and if it's that available once I get into it, I may use it more often. But I was very happy to hear from him. He had a list of the tapes that have gone out. Somebody in Boston evidently gave him a list and gave him a couple of cassettes, and he had read my Realist article, the first published article I ever did, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? So when you speak to people like that or receive calls or letters from other writers or researchers, it is always not only reassuring, but it makes me know that I am on the right track and that these people are exposing for the same purpose, specifically because they are patriotic. That's why they're doing it, and they appreciate when somebody else is doing the same thing. Several weeks ago, I talked about Wilbur Evelyn, who's writing that book, The Rope of Sand, and the letter that he wrote to me and praised, the work that I was doing. He was the bagman for Allen Dulles for a coup in Syria in 1956. So you see, we're miles apart, and yet this man is coming forward now and speaking from direct experience, and this research is very worthwhile to meet these people and understand what they were doing and why they were doing it, and understand why America now is being brought to its knees in a disgraceful position because of bad judgment, ignorance, false patriotism, and going after the wrong enemies at the wrong time. There was an editorial just last week in the New York Times called 31 Years of U.S. Glory and Illusion. It came out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Stephen Miller from Harvard University, the Center for International Affairs, which is hardly a leftist, communist, or anti-American organization. This is very much the nest of the establishment group that Henry Kissinger came out. Mr. Miller talks about the decline of America and the false impression that America's had of their recent history, which really began a long time ago. And he briefly goes into the past 31 years of United States foreign policy. He says, during the late 1940s, the United States possessed a nuclear monopoly, yet in 1948, Czechoslovakia was submerged by the communists. In 1950, we had a stalemate in Korea, Nasser's triumph in Egypt in 1952, major crisis in Indochina and Taiwan in the 1950s, the Suez crisis in 56, the shock of Russia beating us with Sputnik in 1957, the toppling of pro-Western regimes in Cuba and Iraq in 58, and Nikita Khrushchev's recurrent challenges in Berlin in the late 50s. And he goes into the question of whether or not America is a second-class power. In 1958, Drew Pearson and Jack Anderson wrote a book, United States of America, Second-Class Power, ? In which they describe a deluge of defeats. This article goes on, such as Korea and so forth. And in the 60s, where we had American military superiority, ? We had a stalemate and lost in Vietnam. We withdrew from the Bay of Pigs after the French got out of the NATO military command. We were minus one of our strong allies. The Pueblo incident didn't come off as the intelligence wanted it. There was a revolution in Libya where pro-Western monarchy was thrown out. This is a list of setbacks, and he talks about the Soviet buildup in strategic forces and now a Soviet posture in the Middle East moving in. But the question asked by Steve Miller from Center for International Affairs at Harvard, 31 years of U.S. glory and illusion. We've been prepped up and told that we were the best, the strongest, and if we don't really understand where we're going wrong or making mistakes, how can we possibly make it better? I would like to be writing a book on Lee Harvey Oswald, having done 16 years' work on the Kennedy assassination, and yet I found myself this week on Wednesday reading for 12 hours some of the most important articles of various things that are happening in various countries around the world. And it makes me think of the United States compared to, say, a piece of Steuben glass that we thought it was, an artifact, something unique with all our freedoms and profit systems and advantages that other countries didn't have. We thought this was a choice piece of property and that we were chosen people in a way. And all of a sudden, when you drop that glass, that artifact, and it splatters into all of the little pieces that glass can have when it hits concrete or the bottom of that floor and breaks apart is about what the world is doing now. The United States and the world is simply rupturing in pieces, and so that instead of my being able to just quietly sit and write a book about a man named Lee Harvey Oswald and his 125 impersonations of people impersonating him, I spent hours and days looking at important stories, studying maps. There was an article in the New York Times, a map, December the 30th of this year. It's called Vital Statistics, and it has the names of a lot of deposed heads of states that were murdered in most of the countries where the Central Intelligence Agency had been behind these, the changes of government. Another article on the advantages and also the dangers of naval blockade in Iran and what it means to our oil and Japanese oil and Europe oil. Another day I spent studying the borders of the Soviet Union, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, these Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, the Arabian Sea, the Gulf of Oman, the Persian Gulf, studying these boundaries. What do they mean? How big are they? Where are the mountains? What is happening to these people on these land masses, because it will affect us. Another good article this week on tiny Oman guarding the Strait of Hormuz. Another one on Torrijos in Panama, that his power is eroding and the leftists and the people are about to rise up. He's another one that'll be gone soon. Of course, the candidate I said for deposed heads of states, of dictators in 1980 is probably President Marcos in the Philippines. And this week's newspaper had an article, a very important step, in a major step to pacify opposition to martial law. Marcos offered freedom to a man that he's put in prison since 1972 and had a death sentence over him. He was a former senator, Mr. Aquino, who's 47 years old. He's given him a furlough from 7 years in jail and offered him a job on the Council of Leaders. Now, it's very smart of Mr. Marcos because, sure as God made little apples, Marcos will fall pretty soon. But by having his opponent out of jail and given a position in government, he's going to delay that. The Soviets, there are articles out about why they went into Afghanistan, who Amin was, the man that was murdered, how he was funded by the CIA, how he was buying napalm, planning executions of his opponents. There were articles that he was described as a wild butcher, a usurper, a murderer of tens of thousands. The Soviets didn't go into Afghanistan to take the flak of the entire world unless they had a reason. And I was reading some of the background on Amin and AMIN in Afghanistan. Another interesting article about Syria. A representative in the United Nations from Syria is leaving Syria and going to Paris, and he's denouncing Assad's regime. He said it's repressive, it's a police state, and they're doing too much killing. Other articles about Pakistan, the murder of Bhutto, and in Bangladesh, of Ramirez, and how they were replaced in these two countries by martial law and police states. And another one on why Pakistan may refuse U.S. arms. Another article this week on Mexico, the torture of 473 missing people, Indians, peasants, striking workers, and why the Shah was not wanted in Mexico because his opulence and parties and caviars and minks and so forth called attention to the leftists that are ready to overthrow the president in Mexico. There's another interesting article in the New York Times on the torturing of the family of Kim Jae-kyu. He's been charged, along with the others, of killing the president of Korea, Mr. Park, but his family, his brother and sister-in-law and niece or nephew, child, went to Korea to see him after he was arrested, and they were forced to sign false statements that they took money out of Korea and that the money had been siphoned through them, and they were tortured. The child was watching the parents tortured, the electrodes and beatings and clubbings, and kept in cells, torturing going on in Korea with this military government that's taken over. And of course there are many good articles this past week on Saudi Arabia. Two of the heads of the Saudi Arabian government were removed at an airport, I understand, just a few weeks ago, and were beheaded. They have the commander for the armed forces was replaced. The commander of the border troops was replaced. The two army division commanders were replaced. Prince Fawaz, who resigned as mayor of Mecca, he was removed. He's a senior member of the royal family. He's the son of the late King Abdul, the founder of the kingdom there, and half-brother of the present king. Saudi Arabia should turn anti-American, either in a Muslim revolution or refuse to send United States oil, it would mean a total war in the Middle East for the United States to just grab and hold the oil, and we're planning to build bases there. The Saudi Arabian family has fights within it. It's very much insecure. It's shaking our gold market. They're buying gold because they're ready to flee the country if they have to. So that all over the world, I'm just mentioning a few places, Mexico, Argentina, and Saudi Arabia, and these various countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the world is in turmoil. The United States has to send the Secretary of Defense over to China to get China to help arm, eventually against Russia and help us in the Middle East. We're going to be caught in the middle of not knowing who our friends are, who our enemies are, sending weapons anywhere we can sell them, just as we sold the Japanese all the weapons and stockpiles that came back to us at the time of Pearl Harbor. The production of weapons and selling of weapons seems to be the biggest industry going besides organized crime and oil. Those three have the monopoly for business, and the banking firms make money off of this war, loans to put up money and tremendous interest to carry on the warfare because the money really doesn't exist. So we're left right now in 1980, beginning a year with many countries in turmoil, many heads of states ready to roll, extreme poverty, and a waking of the third world. Again, I don't think it is anti-American to call attention to what is happening, because the only way you can deal with it is to understand it first. And understanding it takes lots of hours of reading, listening, buying books, reading newspapers, and so forth, and absorbing what it means to be in those countries, not what it means to be here, but to be in those countries, and watch what came down the last 30 years and see how they feel and how they're going to respond to what our next moves. And you have to identify with their thinking, not what we're used to doing, but what we're capable of doing if we could identify with how they feel. Last week I got off on a subject that I'm going to continue now, because international terrorism is the name of the game. Terrorism that is funded by the right, linked to the Central Intelligence Agencies, a web or network that started after World War II, known as the Odessa or the Spider, that is the Nazi, neo-Nazi, right-wing clan, Minutemen, the Kagulars, the Hooded Ones, a network of violence and bloodshed in order to gain control of the native population through terror or fear. These are universal Reichstags that are carried out with the assistance of organized crime, early Nazi money, and the help of the local police and the Justice Department in every country. I mentioned last week that George Korkola, who has a corporation, Amstead Corporation in New Jersey, which trains and sets up assassination teams, and Frank Terpil of the CIA, were both arrested at the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C., and they did brag that they helped set up the Munich Olympic murders where 11 Israeli athletes were killed. And I asked certain questions last week which were answered in the news this week. One was, where do they get their weapons? Who's supplying them with the weapons and the assassination weapons and the assassination teams? And I also believe that this would connect up to Reverend Moon and the Korea Gate, which in fact it does this week. The answer to some of those weapons is that they're supplied by Mitchell Werbel. This Frank Terpil is described in the Washington Post this week, one of the men who was arrested, born in Brooklyn, enlisted in the Navy when he was 18. He was in the Navy, then went to the military, did a second tour of duty with the Armed Security Branch to repair cryptographic code-breaking equipment, and electronics training was extensive, according to the Army records. He left the Army in 1965 and joined the CIA as a communication specialist, so he must have worked for the National Security Agency with his cryptograph code breaking, and then left the CIA in 1971. He spent time in the Middle East and East Pakistan. He came to the attention in Washington in 1975, Terpil, because he was selling silenced MAC MAC-10 and MAC-11 Ingram machine guns manufactured by Mitchell Werbel of Powder Springs, Georgia. MAC-11 machine guns weigh less than 4 pounds and so forth, and they've been featured in movies such as 3 Days of the Condor and The Killer Force. Remember, the Operation Condor is the assassination teams down in Chile of the Nazis that are sent all over the world. Now, this article in the Post said Werbel, an internationally known arms dealer, said that from time to time Frank Terpil had worked for us selling our machine guns, but Werbel said that any dealings he had with Terpil were approved by the State Department Office of Munitions Control. An interesting thing is that this Mr. Mitchell Werbel, who's a czarist, a white Russian, and trained assassination teams all over the world, works very close with Lyndon LaRoche of the National Caucus of Labor Committee, and they trained his bodyguards, and members of the committee go down and work with Werbel. Werbel is a rightist, a far right-wing reactionary, and LaRoche is closely associated with him. The New Solidarity of May 29, 1979, my birthday last year, has an article, How Zionists Control Arab Terror. But when you read the new articles coming out about the arrests in New York City of just 2 or 3 of the people involved in this worldwide organization, which has been identified by Scotland Yard as a safe house for organized crime, for people getting away, escapees, and for the Central Intelligence Agency combined, working with the highest echelons of government, these people are not the terror that they are spreading with their multi-million-dollar, $10 million weapons sale a year is going to the right wing, not the left, and can be linked to international terrorism on the right. And, of course, LaRoche and Werbel fall right into that category, always blaming the Jews and always blaming the left. An interesting connection of Frank Terpil is his bragging, his claim that he trained this terrorist from Venezuela known as Carlos. Carlos is an important man that I said many times has also been a terror from the right disguised as a left. There's a book on Carlos that I may outline and put some of it on the tape if I get time by Colin Smith. And just the jacket describes Carlos. He killed 2 French policemen and an Arab informer in 1975. He shot Edward Seif, a British Zionist and chairman of Marks and Spencer's, in 1973. In 1974, he organized the Japanese Red Army's assault on the French embassy in Holland. He launched a rocket attack at El Al Jet at Orly Airport in 1975, kidnapped 11 oil ministers at an OPEC meeting in 1975, was responsible for hijacking an Air France plane in Athens, and several of his gang were killed in Entebbe in July of 1976. Carlos has given security and housing for a getaway for Frank Terpil of the Central Intelligence Agency, and the list of his crimes is a mile long, and his connections and his weapons and his techniques are coming from what Werbel describes as permission from the State Department Office of Munitions Control. That's why these arrests in New York City were so important. The men, incidentally, were supposed to be on $1 million bail in separate jails. They've now been given $100,000 bail money, and they're out, and I'm sure that the $100,000 is the equivalent to a cufflink on each arm. There has been a total news blackout, with the exception of several articles in the New York papers and one in the Washington Post. There isn't a single article on the West Coast about the arrests of these men or their connections. Incidentally, the man who wrote the book on Carlos, The Portrait of a Terrorist, lived in Vietnam, Rhodesia, and the Middle East himself, and covered the revolution in Bangladesh. But in 1975, he was named the International Reporter of the Year for his series on Patty Hearst. And if I have time on this tape, I want to do some more on the kidnapping of Patty Hearst and the links of those people to South Korea, CIA, and the brainwashing of the Korean Operation Colston Westbrook and West Davis, working for Reverend Moon and the Central Intelligence Agency as part of an international group before Patty was kidnapped. So that the expert who won the International Reporter Year on Patty Hearst also wrote this book on Carlos. And when you see all the crimes that Carlos committed up to this day, and you realize that he was linked to this electronics firm in New Jersey, or to Frank Terpil of the Central Intelligence Agency, or to the Bobby Vesco, Billy Carter connections with Gaddafi in Libya, then you can draw a map or a net around the world and realize that a lot of the kidnappings, the hijacking, the murdering and bombing has been coming from the right, from these organizations, and they've been trying to blame the left. In the article in New Solidarity of the Labor Party, that same May 29, 1979, they referred to a Mr. Jabara's activities that are being investigated by the Labor Party. This was last May, and his role in the defense team of Robert Kennedy's assassin, Sirhan Sirhan. Well, the New Solidarity refers to it as the assassin. It was the alleged assassin. Thane Caesar, security guard from Lockheed, was the assassin of Robert Kennedy, and Sirhan was brought to Pasadena and his family in 1958 by the Greek Orthodox Church, the same CIA front that brought Marino Oswald to the United States in 1962. And Sirhan has already been offered protection by Gaddafi in the Middle East when he leaves, and he'll go to Libya and move there, the same country that is in cahoots, as I say, with Billy Carter and Robert Vesco and so forth. If they wanted to investigate the assassination of Sirhan, which is mentioned in the May 29, 1979 article, they would pursue it further and get on the heels of the Lockheed Thane Caesar murderer. But it's always this guilt by association and blaming the Zionists for the terror when it's coming from the most fanatical group on the right. There are so much in just the few articles that came out this past week on the arrests in New York City that I'm just going randomly to give you some of the most important information and can't begin to put it in lists or categories, but I'll share with you pieces of these particular characters that are being blocked out of most of the newspapers that you take around the country. You might call your editors or ask them whether the Salinas Californian or whatever paper, why we aren't getting information on these arrests. Mr. Terpil, described formerly the CIA, works for a Washington-based company called Oceanic International. I might have mentioned that before. And Oceanic has offices both in Paris and in Panama. I thought, just as a coincidence, it was kind of interesting because in George Orwell's 1984, the key to Oceania, that was the name of the control group that he described, that broke people into three social classes. And the key to the control of the population was the manipulation of language and speech and changing their words around. But the area that they that he describes in his book, is called Oceania, that's made up of the proles, the mindless workers, that are 85% of the population, and the inner party, the elite, that's 2% of the population, and the remaining 13%, the outer party, which carries out the directives. Now, that's about the way this country breaks down now. It's 1980, but I think I mentioned once before the statistics of how many people actually make changes in our society one way or the other, but 85% are the compromising workers, and that's about the way Oceania or United States is right now. His offices are in Panama or Paris. Does Oceanic have links to Jonestown? There's millions of dollars down in banks in Panama and also Torrijos. And Terpil links, his company links to organized crime, and the safe house that Scotland Yard believed was for the CIA and organized crime. So I'm wondering the connections that, and London was very much a part of Jonestown. I might have brought that up last week, but what are the connections of Terpil in Panama and in Paris and in London to the creation of this experimentation station down in Jonestown? The San Francisco Chronicle said at the time of their arrest, in their possessions, they had 10,000 weapons, Ingram machine guns, safe houses in London. They provided arms for the Palestine Liberation Organization, and they have cadres of men willing to go anywhere in the world to kill. This team have silencers. They have American-made ground-to-air red-eye missiles. They can blow up airplanes, such as that Chicago airplane, the DC-10, that simply exploded, that Sherman Skolnick said was blown up. This is an arsenal of weapons with an intent to make money and kill and control through assassination teams. If I did nothing else but talk about this network or this organization and its connecting links, we could do 52 weeks. This terror on the right is terribly important, as I have said before, because it looks like many Reichstags, as if the left is guilty, Yet it's funded by the federal government, and the justices protect these people, give them low bail so they can leave because they don't want trials. And the headlines are constantly of murder, and yet nobody is pinpointing how broad they are and how big the organization is and where it originally was funded and where it's going the next day, specifically tomorrow. On the other side of this tape, we'll do more about those arrests in New York and the importance of this organization and these men. Next to the article in the Los Angeles Times, the one on the salesman whose business is death, the arrests of Frank Terpil and George Korkola, there's another article right on the same page. Terrorist murder Sicilian official in Palermo, Italy. Gunman yesterday ambushed and shot to death the president of the Sicilian Regional Council and wounded his wife before the eyes of their 2 teenage children. The first terrorist assassination in Italy. Mr. Santi Mattarella, 44, a close ally of Aldo Moro, the former premier and Christian Democratic Party president, who was kidnapped and killed by Red Brigade's gunmen in 1978, which I said was a murder on the right and not the left. Aldo Moro wanted the Vatican to be taxed for their various businesses. He didn't think that all their holdings should be tax-free. He was a foe of the financial dealings of the various Vatican officials, and we know what trouble they're in financially with their links to organized crime, narcotics, and death of witnesses recently since Mr. Sandona's arrest in New York City, who's linked to the Vatican banks. Well, this man and his wife were murdered this week, and after the killings they got several telephone calls. One said that they were gunmen from the members of the Red Brigade. Another call that gave credit for murdering Mr. Mattarella was an ultra-rightist group known as the Revolutionary Fascist Squad. And, of course, I would bet that it was that group that, again, did away with the friend of Aldo Moro. And I wouldn't know yet, it's too soon to know, if this Sicilian Regional Council member wasn't linked to the investigation of the Vatican money and the United States links that I've done tapes on that you can get. There are a lot of deaths going on in Sicily right now that are linked to the finances of the Vatican, and so the president of the regional council there and his wife were murdered just this week. The attorney for Frank Terpil of the CIA from this international major international gun runners operation linked to the intelligence community and the State Department with permission for their assassination weapons. His name is James LaRosa, and he's representing him. He's a criminal defense lawyer in New York City who acknowledged that his client was a former agent of the CIA engaged in gun arms sales throughout the world. The name LaRosa was interesting because there was a LaRosa involved, a Chappaquiddick, and I haven't had time yet to look up that Mr. LaRosa that was a friend of Ted Kennedy's. Also, I mentioned last week that Mr. Terpil not only bragged about training Carlos, the revolutionary, this week, that came out in the newspapers, but said that they had planned and executed the killing of the Israeli athletes in 1972 at the Olympic Games in Munich, that they took pleasure in killing those athletes at that time. The name LaRosa came out in the news, another article this week, the same lawyer for Terpil of the CIA, and usually when a man has been in the CIA and involved in all these operations, the attorney has to be from the CIA because of national security reasons. Well, the New York Times had a long article, U.S. jury is investigating Mr. Meade H. Esposito and his racetrack ties, and this is a prominent Brooklyn Democrat who's been linked several times to possible organized crime, and the attorney for Mr. Meade Esposito is the same James LaRosa who's the attorney for Frank Terpil of the CIA. Of course, it's nice to have a Brooklyn Democratic boss whose attorney is working with Terpil, who also works with Libya and Gaddafi and Billy Carter and Vesco, and that can of worms. The article in the New York Times goes on to describe Mr. Esposito's operations. It says that he was engaged in negotiations for an $18 million mortgage for a hospital in New Jersey, a building in Manhattan, various restaurants and homes operated by a Catholic order that takes care of the destitute and aged. Of course, that opens up a can of worms of Catholic corruption in New York front and dummy fronts with organized crime. That I've done tapes of Rosalind Carter and her visits with members of organized crime in Washington, D.C., and then in New York City, the dummy fronts of crime and the Catholic Church linked together. So Mr. Esposito, not guilt by association, but this article has him involved with the Catholic Order. He has interest in Holiday Inn motels in New Jersey. And, of course, one of these defendants, Korkola, again, maybe coincidence, but the electric company from New Jersey that works with ExxonMobil and Scotland Yard must be a large company. And he has Holiday Inns in New Jersey. And this article says that he also has enterprises in Miami and offices in Los Angeles with a group called American International Group, a $2.5 billion New York-based holding company with a wide variety of insurance operations. Now, the part that's interesting in the New York Times article is it said the Los Angeles venture was handled by Richard H. Hanna, a former United States representative of California, a paid director of mortgage affiliates, on a motion by Mr. Esposito, according to minutes of the company in 1946. Now, Mr. Hanna was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for accepting $200,000 from Tongsun Park in the South Korean scandal of Koreagate influence in buying members of Congress. So just briefly, and I can't go into all the details because I want to do some more about Mr. Terpil and Korkola, I want to bring out this can of worms of a racetrack scandal, the Catholic Church, New Jersey, Los Angeles, Miami, a $2.5 billion New York operation, and the South Korean, again, the Korean scandal, the buying of Congress, and the links of organized crime, the Central Intelligence agents, the common lawyers, the network spread across the country because, as I've said before, the removing of the Shah of Iran and the replacement of Khomeini and the increase of the growing of the opium poppy and the traffic in the Middle East, the handling of organized crime and narcotics traffic and the narcotics war is overlooked by the major media. I can't pretend in an hour a week to give you an adequate cover of all the tentacles or threads or their links to Nazi, RITA, CIA money, but there's this common location of offices and interests and buying of Congress and links to Jimmy Carter and the presidency and Rockefeller and the New Jersey locations that you have to do a little homework on your own and read some of these articles, but they are all coming out at the same time. There's another article on terrorism in the Los Angeles Times, January the 4th. Terrorist groups in Italy linked to similar bands in the United States and Europe. And it goes into the kidnapping and killing of Prime Minister Aldo Moro in Italy, and it's linked to terrorist groups in the United States, West Germany, Ireland, and Spain. But they haven't yet admitted that the very people involved were right-wing, government-connected, CIA, military, Defense Department connected, disguised as the left, what I call the international mini Reichstags, which are taking place to make the left suffer, that actually come from the right. There was a picture in the Washington Post in an article by John Vinokur, Terror Almost Commonplace. This was just January the 2nd, 1980, from Bonn, Germany, and it talks about terrorism in different countries and how the kidnappings of various personages like Seen Holly in Guatemala and how 3 terrorists were released. But there's a photograph of the masked Arab terrorists on the balcony of the Israeli quarters at Munich Olympic Games with a big square in 1972. But while the article is coming out telling you the dangers of terrorism, it does not make connections with the men that were arrested December 24th in New York City and pinpoint where the terror is coming out. This article does say, however, about the killing of the 11 Israeli athletes and the 4 terrorists and 2 policemen who were killed. There were 17 people killed in that ambush. It does say it is considerably less remembered that Abu Daoud, D-A-O-U-D, the reputed leader of the Munich attack, was arrested in France in 1976. This is a man linked with Terpil and his organization, that he was arrested in France. But the prospect of a terrorist reprisal for fear of displeasing the Arab oil producers was so great that neither France nor Germany jumped on the chance to try him. In a day or so, he was flown out of France, a free man, with a first-class ticket to Algeria. So the man that was put up to represent the intelligence military community that did spread this terrorism to the Olympic Games was released because the Middle East countries didn't want to be displeased. He had done his job well. He had killed the Jewish athletes, and he was allowed by the police in France to leave the country at the request of the Middle East. And it's those countries that Mr. Terpil and his buddy Korkola are supplying the weapons with, as I say, $10 million a year, and so they don't want any harassment, and the person who is sent to do the shooting or is responsible for setting it up, he's allowed to go off and fly out to Algeria in order to please the Middle East, which is part of the Borman Brotherhood and the Grand Mufti and the Hitler Organization in the beginning, and they wiped out no other athletes, just 11 Jewish athletes. There was a lot of fuss about the Olympic Games, and there's another article, an arrest or a probe several days after these men were arrested in New York City, Korkola and Terpil. 3 days later, December 27th, this is the Washington Post. This wasn't in the New York Times. This is a Washington Post article. It said, U.S. probes affirm here and in New York, in Washington, D.C., that Washington, D.C. police seized $100,000, an item that was used for surveillance. The U.S. Attorney's Office is investigating one of the nation's largest electronic surveillance firms, a New York firm based called CCS Incorporated. Now, CCS is a criminal conspiracy section of the Los Angeles Police Department that was linked to Hunt and Lydia McCord and Nixon and the Iranian Savak. And it's interesting, this one of the nation's largest electronic firms is called CCS. Again, that parallel of Oceanic Corporation in Washington, Oceanic in 1984. The CCS in New York, and their major client before the Shah was kicked out of Iran was the Shah of Iran. Their major client was Iran before the country's recent revolution. They were raided by police here because CCS is under investigation also in New York City as well as in Washington for shipping electronic surveillance equipment overseas, and the New York State Select Committee on Crime is linking the ties to the February Olympic Games, the Winter Games at Lake Placid in New York. CCS, the electric firm, has advertised widely as the electronic security supplier for Lake Placid, but the Olympic officials have disputed CCS's exact role. Remember, James McCord at Watergate was in charge of the security for the re-election of the president in 1972, and this firm that is under investigation for supplying electronic equipment around the world and formerly for the Shah of Iran is advertising that they are in charge of the Olympic security. A New York official said that 40 infrared sniper scopes were among equipment in their crates that was seized at John Kennedy Airport as far away as last March, but I don't remember reading a thing about it. And they were going to have the security for the Winter Games that would be breached. They were afraid that if they were at the Winter Olympics, the security would be breached by terrorist groups who might have gained access to their extensive group of bombs and bomb detections and eavesdropping and monitoring devices and those infrared sniper scopes. So the federal officials are investigating this, and they had a meeting. The Washington, D.C. Raided their meeting of the CCS, that's the name of the electronic firm, in their Georgetown office on December the 9th, and they had a meeting. It was $350 a person, an electronic security seminar that was held where else? The Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. The CCS was having a seminar on electronic surveillance, but these people have been investigated by the grand jury, and again, it brings up the problem of possible violence at the Olympic Games and some more murdering, bombing, monitoring, eavesdropping, and killing. There's a lot of talk about whether the Olympic Games should go on or not because the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. I felt that the next Olympic Games would be a source of violence and killing identical to Munich, and maybe try to blame the Soviet Russians, and we would be willing to go to war if our athletes were killed. I think it's a can of worms for spies, and it would be best left alone rather than to have another Reichstag kind of thing. So this electronic firm that was working sells their major clients are the Middle Eastern governments of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and they spent more than $350,000 supplying equipment for the games that were to take place next February. So that a government agency or an agency that supplies these governments overseas and the Shah of Iran that makes bulletproof vests, metal detectors, and so forth for our airport security devices would be, in terms, a security force at the Olympic Games, but it also could be a place where their bombs and devices could go off and cause the wrong people to be blamed for the killings. Now, on the time that is remaining on this tape, I would like to run down a few items that were in the very limited newspaper articles on the New York arrest. A man named William H. French is president of the ADCO Airlines. His office is in Paris, and he wants to ship planes to Libya from Georgia. They've been stationed down in Georgia, and the sale hasn't gone through. And he employed Frank Terpil of the CIA when Terpil went to Europe in 1971. Now, those are the same airplanes that allegedly were involved in Robert Vesco trying to get for Libya, and that if Jimmy Carter offered him, pay off, the scandal that I have mentioned on other tapes or suggested was that if Carter offered him not to be extradited for prosecution, that he would work with the Libyan government, and as an agent, registered as an agent for Libya, Billy Carter is trying to get those airplanes from Georgia delivered, and the company that would deliver them is William French, who hired Frank Terpil. So you see the assassination weapons come from Georgia, from Mitchell Werbel with their silencers, and also William French is working with airplanes in Georgia that involve the president's brother. And I hope I'm not going too fast that you can see some of the can of worms. Frank Terpil was described as married. He has 3 children. He lives in McLean, Virginia. When he was arrested December 24th, his $250,000 home was put on the market for sale, I imagine because he will be leaving the company. Oceanic International is located at 2020 Connecticut Avenue, New York City, in case you want to do investigations on what kind of a firm it is and see if it is like McCord Associates, just a dummy front. The Hunter's Lodge that he bought in England, I think I mentioned before, was more than $500,000. The location of the lodge is in Crewe, C-R-E-W-E, Great Britain. A description of Terpil in the New York Times said that he had high-level contacts, and Scotland Yard said that among the group there were extensive contacts among high-ranking American and British military officials, and he had access to end-user certificates, which are official government's documents for exporting arms from Great Britain. Well, they also described in another article in the New York Times the extensive contacts of British military with organized crime and the combination of the Central Intelligence Agency and organized crime. I received a book this week called The Train Robbers by Pierre Paul Reed, sent to me by one of the listeners of the tapes who follows history very, very closely. And in studying international terrorism, or where the money goes, this book fit in right with the possible Terpil operations, and again, the coincidences become overwhelming. This book on the train robbers begins with an introduction and a story of Otto Skorzeny. He was Hitler's right-hand man who organized what is known as the Odessa, O-D-E-S-S-A, the worldwide organization of former members of the SS, that these old Nazis could sustain themselves through crime and also, you see, through organized crime and narcotics. There's a large Nazi mafia that works, but Skorzeny was involved with this train robbery, this great train robbery, and in the introduction of the book, it brings up his organization. The introduction says there was a Mr. Big behind the train robbery, behind the crime, a man who financed it and received in return £1 million of the stolen money. He was Otto Skorzeny, the officer of the Waffen-SS who commanded the German commandos during the war and had rescued Mussolini. Now, Skorzeny was operating with the men in the train robbery, and then when you read towards the back of the book, there's a description of the driver of the train, of the various people that got off. In the end, they have a chapter called Release, and it talks about February 1970, the driver of the train, Jack Mills, died in Crewe, England. Now, it wasn't until officially, much later, 1978, that Frank Terpil bought the inn for $500,000 where the CIA and organized crime and various escapees from assassinations and crimes were kept as a safe house. That was also in Crewe, England. So again, the question if Terpil is linked to the international Nazis in Odessa by way of Reverend Moon and their money funded from Southeast Asia and this network of Odessa all over the world, if Terpil and Korkola are linked to that, and if one of the safe houses is in Crewe, England, did they buy it or could they buy it with money, say, from the great train robbery? Much of it was never accounted for, and some of it went down to Brazil. But a lot of the crimes being committed are to fund rightist organizations, and then the funds use the money so that Terpil and these people could sell $10 million a year worth of weapons, because the weapons come from bank robberies where the robbers, such as the one in Nice, Italy, are allowed to escape because they're helping the rightist cause. And they're taking the justice, the police, and so forth, are allowing them to leave the police buildings so they can continue taking the money from safe deposits, banks, train robberies, and put it into weapons so that eventually they have this network in every country around the world. We got a little sample of what you call independence in the news this week, and to be specific, how the right-wing network with guns, machine guns, bombs, and devices will work when it comes to the push and shove. The President of the United States said we will not ship more wheat to the Soviet Union, but there was a $1 million purchase that was paid for that was going to be shipped, and he said complete that sale. And the longshoremen said we are not sending that to the Soviet Union. The United States government can forfeit the $1.5 billion. The farmers can give it up. We will not load it. And on the Today Show, Tom Brocco said to the head of the union, or the longshoremen, isn't this chaos? If the president says one thing and you go against his wishes, aren't you inviting chaos in the United States? And the answer was, when the president was inaugurated, he said, I will need the help of the people. So we are going to help him. And that means no matter what presidential orders go out from this moment on, as of January the 11th, 1980, any group, the Minutemen, the Nazis, the states' rights parties, the secret army organizations, they are located every 20 miles across the United States and heavily, heavily armed with every kind of device and weapon they need and grenades. And if they want to go against the president's orders, they'll say, this is our interpretation of patriotism, and we will not do what you tell us. And if the average person can't meet fire with fire, then they take over, because they have stockpiled and sold and created ammunition with this money that has been going on for years, ever since World War II. And they will have control of the population through their various devices and the intent. If the intent is there, and if we want coexistence with the Soviet Union and they don't want it, the power has been moved away from the president to the hands of the people. If the Teamsters and the longshoremen don't load or don't deliver or don't bring food into a city or go on strike, that's it. And we're in a terrible position now because of the proliferation of arms to all kinds of idiots who have the power and the intent to go against the president's orders if they think it's best. And this was one example this week, and I think you should watch it closely because, as they said on the TV, this invites chaos, and it invites more than chaos. You get a total dictatorship in the hands of the far right, who now are armed through people like Korkola and Terpil and Mitch Warbel, who are sending these weapons out. They should all be called in. But you see, when men like that are arrested in New York City, 3 men were arrested, and the third man was an acknowledged member of an assassination team, and he was released and let loose. Evidently, murder isn't a crime when you're murdering for the government or for these people. So the third person was released, and when 2 were put on $100,000 bail, and he puts his house for sale in Washington, D.C., he doesn't intend to spend 25 years in jail or any time at all, and he will be out of the country maybe by the time you get these tapes. There certainly isn't a word about them in the news media. There's dead silence. The New York Times described Terpil and Korkola as freelance military specialists who harbor fugitives, sell illegal weapons, train terrorists and military activities, and run a series of front companies throughout the world. The New York Times also said January the 7th that the leader of this group is still at large, that he's the target of federal grand jury in Washington, D.C. The leader of the multi-billion-dollar arms sale is at large. 2 men were taken in and released. One of the admitted assassins wasn't even held. The kinds of weapons they had: radar-controlled anti-aircraft missiles, as I said before, powerful explosive poisons, remote control bombs, weapons from Worbel in Georgia from British and American factories, mainly manufactured in Britain, where laws regulating arms sales are more lenient. The customers of these men were Idi Amin in Uganda, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and the Libyan government. All of these groups are violently anti-Semitic, that were linked to the Grand Mufti and the hatred of Jews and the International Odessa, and it would be perfectly natural to arm them to the teeth with weapons, as well as being linked, say, to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and Panama. But some of their best customers are Idi Amin, who has been violently anti-Semitic, the PLO, and Libya, and then they in turn can distribute them all over the world to other people if they want to. They also were caught with false certificates. As I said, they have what they call an end-user permission to ship weapons around the world and have access to the highest-ranking documents in British and American military offices. But one of the places that was raided showed that they have this end-user certificate to export 10,000 machine guns. It was listed for Philippines. That was the destination, but the New York Times article on the 7th said it was a false address. It was going somewhere else. On the crate, they put Philippines. But you see, the Soviet Union has said that we were arming Amin over in Afghanistan, not Idi Amin, the other Amin, in Afghanistan with napalm and weapons from the United States. So the 10,000 machine guns that were headed, in quotes, for the Philippines could go to Turkey and the Iranian forces, the anti-Khomeini forces, into Afghanistan, Pakistan, and so forth, for war against the Soviet Union if they decide to invade those countries too. The guns could be used to fight each other or to protect themselves from the Soviet Union. Terpil and Korkola allegedly met each other 3 years ago in 1976, and this Mr. French, who runs that air freight company, came to Washington, D.C. and had an office with Terpil in his office, and then after he moved in, Terpil disappeared for 8 months in 1976. Of course, we don't know what countries he was in, and his wife didn't even know where he went. And Mr. French just stayed in the office at Washington, D.C., and Terpil was off with his weapons and violences, and as I say, there's no way of knowing what countries he was in yet. I mentioned last week that their car in New York City was listed to the United Nations under the Uganda mission, that they had a car that was protected by a United Nations license. They also had unlimited passports, and they bragged on tape cassettes that they had access to fraudulent American passports and that they could provide passports for fugitives from justice, and they could travel wherever they want all over the world. I don't think it would be hard for these guys to skip out with a $100,000 bail, considering the amount of expertise they have in the papers that could be written for them if they wanted to scram out of here. I mentioned last week my article on the SLA is the CIA, because it's that kind of terrorism that began to be formed in 1968 after the Chicago conventions, when the youth were assembling in the anti-war protests. And there were international connections that I made note of in that article, the SLA is the CIA, and asked about these various people that were over in Europe prior to when the SLA was formed, and wondering who they saw at that time and what they were doing there. Willie Wolfe was in Europe for 9 months before he moved to California and joined the SLA. Angela Atwood was in Europe. She had a trip to Europe before she came west. Her father, incidentally, was an official in the Teamsters Union, and Angela Atwood was buried in New Jersey. And again, I wonder if there's any connection to the electronics firm or the espionage coming out of New Jersey. Wes Davis of the SLA was part of World Humanity Against Totalitarianism. That was a group they set up the speeches of Reverend Moon, who defended Richard Nixon, and Moon, of course, was part of General Park's South Korean intelligence. Camila Hall had traveled in Spain, and I asked in that article in 1974 what other countries did she go to, and Colson Westbrook was over in Europe. There were a whole group of the SLA people who were in Europe just prior to they moved to California, and then joined the ranks of the SLA out here in California to infiltrate the various organizations. I listed the organizations and the chronology, and I may, just to review with you next week, do a little more on the SLA as the CIA and the international terrorism. In the meantime, in any of the newspapers where you are, if you find any articles on these characters that were arrested and international terrorism, save them and copy them and send them to me, because it's terribly important. I don't know why people have sat quiet so long, but it's time to say that the airplane hijackings, the kidnappings, bombings, assassination attempts, accomplished murders, much of this that is being written off as terrorism must be identified to American agencies, American money, our wheeling and dealing, even linked right up to the White House. It should be exposed, and at any point you want to scream and shout about it, it's the point to start objecting to this subterfuge that's getting us into bloodshed in every country. Read the newspapers. It's spreading all over the world. This is Mae Brussell and Carmel. You take care until next week. Stay away from the terrorists, and I'll be with you next week.